until around the 1950s, people began to figure out the pituitary was not a master gland. Somehow or other, it was getting its directions from the brain, from the hypothalamus. And somebody at that time came up with the notion, a scientist, a British scientist, endocrinologist, pioneer named Geoffrey Harris. And this guy came up with the notion that what you have is the brain working as an endocrine gland. When you look at the anterior pituitary, it is not exactly connected with the base of the hypothalamus. What you have instead is a tiny, tiny circulatory system connecting the hypothalamus with the anterior pituitary. And the notion then was that the hypothalamus secreted hormones, which then went down to the anterior pituitary and told those cells which hormones to secrete into the main circulation. Neurobiologists hated this concept simply because something seemed kind of demeaning and disgusting and yucky about the brain being an endocrine gland. The brain does this sort of gleaming calculations that for you, and here it is drooling out hormones instead. There's tremendous resistance to the idea of the brain as an endocrine gland. And it took a number of scientists, a pair of them in fact decades, to prove that this was in fact the case, and they got their Nobel Prizes out of it, showing the brain is an endocrine organ. And what you wind up seeing in the anterior pituitary world is all of the hormone release coming out of there is directly under endocrine control of the hypothalamus. You've got the hypothalamus with its hypothalamic hormone secreting neurons there, dumping their hormones into that local circulation where they go down, and their job is to stimulate, to inhibit, to regulate what these pituitary gland cells are doing. We have a first pass here of the brain as the central regulator of endocrine systems. Okay, the second way in which the brain is completely in charge is of the much more conventional reassuring posterior pituitary, which people had known how that had worked for decades, and none of this sort of heretical revisionism about the brain as an endocrine gland. This one was much simpler to make sense of. It turns out the posterior pituitary is really just an outpost of the brain. The brain in this case just has this little bit of hypothalamic tissue dribbling down there and happened to merge with the anterior pituitary. And in this case, you didn't have to come up with this weird scenario of hormones circulating in this tiny little local system. Here instead, you simply have the cell bodies of those neurons sending their projections down to the posterior pituitary, and it's those exact same axon terminals that are releasing the hormones in those cases. And there's two principal hormones in the posterior pituitary, oxytocin and vasopressin, and these have a whole lot to do with giving birth, with milk let down, with contraction of the uterus. In this case, we have complete control of these hormones by way of the brain once again, in this case by way of these axons coursing down into the posterior pituitary. Now this is great. We've got these scenarios here where forget these peripheral blabs knowing what they're doing, forget the pituitary as the